All right. So for tonight and next Sunday night, we're going to spend some time talking about a subject that I went through with the high school / teenage class when we were in Vacation Bible School to help us try and understand what's going on in the world around us. And so as we think about culture and identity, so let me begin this way. How did culture get to a point when one of the most universally recognized truths wasn't even questioned, was that there is a difference between a male and a female? When did we get to the point where a kid in school can, and this happened in Brooke's hometown, and it's happened in plenty of other places, I'm sure, that a kid can identify as a cat, and the teachers have to adjust? They have to allow the child to make cat noises in the middle of class. They have to, listen, here's the thing. We can close our eyes and wish like everything that it's going to just somehow go away. Or we can open our eyes and start realizing it's not going anywhere, and we've got to learn how to think through it. Okay? And a lot of it has to do with identity, because a lot of people are wondering, and I have wondered it myself, how do we get to this point? How did we go from such a simple understanding of what we would call even a self-evident truth? I mean, it's so self-evident. Like, we thought of all the things that were questioned, at least that one, it didn't seem like it would ever be questioned in any way. Well, that's what I want us to think about, and think about how we got here with identity. Now, I will tell you a couple of caveats to a couple of things. Number one, the structure of what I'm giving you tonight, the illustrations, things along those lines, they are not mine. They are not original. Okay? They come from a man who passed away about a year ago now, who was one of the leading thinkers in this realm. And his name was Timothy Keller. He was a Presbyterian preacher in New York. And he dealt with a lot of secular people. So the way he approached things was very different. And so I don't claim originality here. And even everything he says, and you can see some of his YouTube videos discussing identity, and he does a really good job. I don't agree with every notion that he puts forward. He's got a Calvinistic understanding of our inability to fulfill God's will, and that kind of taints some ways that he views things. But anyway, all in all, it is good. And he does a masterful job, and that's what I want to share with you, is just kind of tonight, just chart the course. What is an identity? How is it formed? How does it affect us? How does identity have anything to do with human sexuality or even gender or any of these issues? Well, it's all wrapped up together, and this is what we have to understand. To understand and to adequately address the issues, and not even just issues, we're dealing with people who are struggling with things. So we don't need to completely dehumanize it, because we're not dealing with, objects. We're dealing with people who have issues, who have problems the same way that we do. And so how do we handle it correctly? How do we communicate with them? For an example, if you and I were talking about what does it mean to be a male or a female, you could look at me and say, the Bible says there is a distinction between male and female. And you know what? I'd take you. I'd say you're right. Now, why? I'm a Bible-believing Christian. But when you're dealing with people who are not Bible-believing Christians, you have to come at it differently. Okay? So the way the culture has shifted. So, for an example, apologetics. Okay, we talk about apologetics, many times associated, it's a broad term, but many times associated with the existence of God, things along those lines. So for many years, apologetics was what we called propositional apologetics. We employed logic. You had a major premise and a minor premise and a conclusion. We employed logic. It worked when you had people who believed that you could arrive at truth through rational thought and logic. But now we're in a completely different climate. And the way we approach it has to be something along the lines that's called presuppositional apologetics. Now, all that means is this. It's making an argument that not only is Christianity true, verifiably true, but if you compare what Christianity teaches and how it affects a person's life and how it brings human flourishing to the individual, you compare it with other viewpoints. The argument we're making with presuppositional, it's just a fancy word, is that Christianity is the one that actually helps humanity the most. That's what we're saying, okay? So, even the way we approach it is different, okay? Now, let's move into this and talk for a minute, and hopefully we will make a little bit more sense as we go forward. So let's talk about the basics of identity formation. The first thing we need to understand is that identity formation is imposed upon us. Nobody goes home one day and sits down. I mean, I didn't. I don't know that I've ever done it. Gone home and sat down and said, what is my identity? I'm not talking about like my name and like identification card. I mean, who am I as an individual? That's why you hear a lot of people today talking about gender fluidity, identity. What am I identifying as? Because now identity is not something that's inherently true, okay? Identity, they believe, is socially constructed. That is, you're bringing in something that your culture is telling you is true. And so you can have your physical body be one thing, but you can identify as another thing. Okay? And one of the reasons you can do that is because identity is constructed. So, you can have people saying, I'm a man trapped in a woman's body, or I'm a woman trapped in a man's body, and so on. But this is what we need to understand. All cultures impose an identity upon us. They don't ask us, they don't tell us, and many times they don't even know they're doing it themselves. It's just a way that we look at the world. And that's why sociology obviously spends a lot of time studying generations, how the generations think. Okay? So, and people say, well, what does all this have to do with biblical things? Well, first of all, a whole lot. The first of which is, you remember Paul says in Romans 12 and verse 2 that he gives us an imperative, a set of imperatives and commands that says, do not be conformed to the world, but be transformed. If you don't know what the world is doing, how do you know what needs to change? How do you know how Christianity speaks into and basically says that is not something that's helpful for you? And so it's something that's imposed upon us. Now, identity basically comes from answering a couple of questions, okay? And that is, where do you get your sense of self? What is the most important thing? What do you live for? Now, traditionally in cultures, and even if I would say in many Christian cultures, Christian churches, if I were to ask this question, a lot of people would say something like Jesus. Others would say something like, and even in like conservative states like Alabama, a lot of people would say, well, I live for my family. I do all these things and do these things to make sure that my family's cared for. So there's identity is constructed out of where you find your sense of self. And then number two, it's constructed with your sense of worth. It's a sense of worth. What makes you feel like you have lived life and accomplished? You have flourished. So for an example, one construct is if And there's nothing inherently wrong with this. Please understand that. If I can go to work and better myself and better my family, then I've been successful. That's what validates me. I can prove that proves I'm a good person. Okay? So you're looking at who validates you. Okay? Who do you look to that says, hey, you did a good job? Okay? So we're dealing with a sense of self. What's the most important thing I live for? And then who tells me whether I'm doing the most important thing? That's an identity. Okay? Now, let's talk about traditional identity formation. And this has been true for a great portion of the history of the world. Okay? So traditional identity formation comes like this. It's about honor, the greatest good, and the majority of our world, I would still say, follows the traditional identity. Okay, so what you should do is sacrifice yourself for the good of the family unit or your community. For an example, back before you had nations and other things and you had villages that you needed to protect yourself, the men sacrificed themselves for the good of the community by going to war to defend it. The women sacrificed their health in order to bear children because there were high mortality rates for having children. So they sacrificed themselves in order to have children so that the community might continue. Okay? That's a notion of what it is. And so if you put the community above yourself, if you serve a bigger good in your community, then that means you're a good person. That's traditional identity. Okay? Now, when you get into the times of the philosophers who in the intertestament period with Greece and different things along those lines, they believed that good was... So, in John 1, when the Bible says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, that the word translated word is logos. And it's no accident that John chose that word, because the Greek philosophers believed that there was this order of truth that existed, kind of mystically floated out here. Okay? And so what you should then do is use your mind to discover what the sacred order of the world is. And when you discover what that sacred order of the world is, then you submit yourself to it. You obey it. Okay? That's why they put a big price on reason and thinking through and logic and the developments of a number of different particular issues. So if you did that, then your community would call you a virtuous person. So you had lived up. That's a traditional identity, okay? Then we got on this road in about the 15, 16, 1700s that led us into what we're dealing with a modern identity, okay? I want you to track the progression. You have what is known as early modernity, 16th and 17th century, so 1500s, 1600s. And that is that truth exists outside of you. Okay? What does that mean? Do you hear the phrase a lot today, my truth? My truth. You would never hear that before in the history of the world. Because no one believed that truth existed inside of an individual, that we've always believed that truth existed outside of us. Something as simple as 2 + 2 = 4. That exists outside of us. It's not in us. It's outside of us. It's just true. Okay? And so, where we began to depart was, we began to look at this and we began to say, well, we can come to that truth through our own reasoning ability, and we can determine what good is, and we can submit ourselves to it. It was similar to what the Greeks did, but it wasn't exactly the same. Then in the 18th and 19th centuries, what is known as the Romantic period, the sacred order was still outside of yourself. But the way you found what you were supposed to live your life for was through self-expression. So you have a lot of art. And in art, you're revealing and you're searching. You're just kind of painting your emotions. You're sculpting your emotions. You're doing all these different types of things. And through that process, you're discovering who you are. You're discovering what the social order is. Then we come to late or post-modernity. So the 1900s and the year 2000 forward. And this is where it all changed. I understand this may not necessarily be the most interesting thing on the surface. But if you want to understand our world, you have to understand it. This is where the shift happened. In the previous generations of the history of the world, truth existed outside of us. In late and post-modernity, truth no longer existed outside of us. Truth existed inside of us. And that's extremely dangerous. That is, you determine what truth is. Truth is not something that is simply true for everybody across the world. It's subjective. It's how you feel. It's how I feel. It's my truth. And people say, well, what's the big deal? It's not like people are going to run around and kill each other because of their truth. The only problem is that's verifiably false. They did it. You see, the people who make that kind of foolish argument that say, we're not going to just run around and kill people if there's not a truth outside of us, the answer is yes, we will. The 20th century was the bloodiest century in the history of the world. We killed more people in the 20th century than we did the previous 19 put together. Russia and China leading the way at 100 million people apiece. If truth exists inside of me and not outside of me, then answer this question. How can we take something like the Nuremberg trials, where we put the Nazis on trial for crimes against humanity? How can you convict them of doing wrong if truth is inside of you? You can't. That was their truth. So one of the things that we're trying to say is this approach is not just it's not just badly mistaken, it leads to utter chaos. It cannot and does not work. And so that's how we have kind of come down to this portion. And so what we have said is this, that all moral values are relative and socially constructed. Okay? You just simply determine what is good. When you look inside your heart, what do you see? That's what's good. You live it. Okay? That's the first part of your identity. What should you do? The second part is, who do you look to for validation? Who tells you you're doing a good job? Well, if it's inside you, the only person that can tell you that's you. And what we're going to see in just a minute is that's absolutely impossible. Okay, so let's summarize this and kind of contrast traditional and modern identities, okay? In the first place, the ultimate good of the self has been moved from the outside to the inside. We're kind of summarizing what we're seeing of a modern identity and what many of us grew up with in a traditional identity. Truth went from something that existed outside of us, and now truth is something that only exists within us. And you have to figure out what that is for you. Number two, you notice how in a traditional identity, what is it that drives you? Your duty. Your duty to the community. Your duty to humanity. But now with modern identity, what drives you? It's not a sense of duty about other people. It's about what you want. It's about your desires. Number 3, the place of argument changes. The place of the whole argument absolutely changes. You see, in traditional cultures, this is the way arguments work. Truth exists outside of you, and it calls upon you as an individual to acknowledge and submit to that truth. Now watch this and see if this sounds familiar. This is modern identity. Truth exists inside of you, and it calls on everyone outside of you to submit to that. Okay, let me explain it like this then. I have gender fluidity. I identify, my pronouns are they, them. People say that's plural. That's right, because we're non-binary. We're not picking. So we identify as multiple genders. And so every time, if you refer to me as him, I'm going to file a complaint with HR. And you're going to have to go to sensitivity training because you did not refer to me as they, which are my recognized pronouns. Because that's my truth. Whether you acknowledge it or not, that doesn't matter. It's my truth, and you have to submit to it. You see what's happening? You see why you see why our society is functioning how it is? It's not truth exists and every individual has to function. Now every individual creates their own truth, and then everybody else has to submit to the truth that they've created. Except we run into the problem of everybody's creating different truths. Which one do you submit to? People say, what's happening in our world is chaos. It's crazy. Yes, it is. It is the height of insanity. And then our validation changes. It moves from people in my community tell me I'm doing a good job to I tell myself I'm doing a good job. Okay? So traditional identity is the way many of us, probably most of us, were raised. Modern identity, there's no such thing as a sacred order, no such thing as truth, and it needs to be eradicated. So very quickly, let me give you a number of problems with this. Number one, it's incoherent. It doesn't make any sense. It does not cohere. It does not stick together, okay? Now, let's see why this is. If my feelings determine what is true, we got a problem on many levels, one of which is I have feelings that contradict each other. I don't want to be overweight, but I also want to eat all the time. Which one you listen to? If what is inside of me is what should guide me, if that determines what is true, then how do I pick which one? And so it doesn't hold together. It's asking something of us that we simply cannot sustain. All right? And it's constantly changing. Number two, it's very, very fragile. It's very, very fragile. The term was developed of a generation that they're kind of a snowflake generation. That is, if you disagree with them, when you disagree with people, they completely melt down and they take it as a personal attack. People say, why is that? See, when I disagree with someone, I can disagree with someone without attacking them as a person because I believe that truth is something that exists outside of us, and we're debating what truth is. It's not saying you're a terrible person. It's saying this is truth. But if truth is inside of you and it's what you determine, when I disagree with it, what am I doing? I am attacking you in your eyes. You are a bigot. You are a hateful human being then. And when you attack me and when you disagree with me, the answer is not for me to simply argue back logically and disagree with you. The answer for me is I will absolutely melt down because no one is allowed to disagree with me. It's fragile. It doesn't hold up. We cannot function as a society that way. All right? Number 3, it is absolutely crushing. So in traditional cultures, excuse me, the way that you fit into a traditional culture was you blended into the culture. You did your part in your community. With a modern identity, now what's the hallmark? It's not about blending in. It's about standing out. Why do we see certain individuals with absolutely zero qualifications as social media influencers who have no idea what they're talking about on anything? Why does someone like Madonna in an interview say, I always feel the need to reinvent myself so that I don't become irrelevant? You can never be peaceful. You can never be at peace because you're always having to find another way to stand out. You always got to find a way to up the ante. And the weight of that on your shoulders will crush you. But it won't just crush you, it'll also crush your romantic relationships. Okay? Because inevitably, this is what happens. In romantic relationships, when our partner that we love criticizes us, it'll absolutely destroy us. If the individual that we are married to, or we're in a significant relationship with, if they disagree with us, it destroys us. But you know what it also does? It also causes me to suppress my own disagreements with them. Because what if I tell you this and you don't like it and you leave me? And those are abuse cycles, by the way. That's how abuse takes place. Next, it's fragmenting. What do you mean by fragmenting? Well, if truth exists inside of you, then I'm going one way, Dwayne's going another way, Randy's going another way. We're all going into, it's fragmenting. It's all over the place. It's absolutely unlivable. It's also excluding. You see, this is the great lie. The great lie is the people in our culture right now are for inclusion. They are lying through their teeth. They are not for inclusion. They are not for inclusion. They are for inclusion as long as you agree with them. That's not inclusion. Inclusion is, I believe that you have the right to hold a judgment that is different than mine, but it will not ever allow me to harm you or to hurt you physically. You have the right to voice your opinion the same way I have the right to voice mine. So it ends up being excluding because you're not enlightened and you don't understand it anymore. You don't know what you're talking about, and you're not culturally sensitive. But ultimately, it's really a sham. So this illustration comes from, I think the man who developed it was a sociology or psychology professor from Princeton or Harvard. He would ask it to his class quite often. So let's say, in this hypothetical, you have a 16th century Anglo-Saxon, so like a British warrior. Now, he looks inside of his heart, and he finds two desires. One is the desire to kill people. The other is the desire for other men. Let me ask you something. What is that Anglo-Saxon warrior going to do? He's going to look at the desire to kill people and say, that's my identity, that's who I am. And the homosexual desires I feel for other men, that's not who I am. That just needs to be suppressed. Right, now flip it on its head. There's a man right now in modern day New York City, and he looks inside of his heart and he says, I see two things in my heart. I have a desire to kill people, but I also have a desire for other men. And when I taught this to the teenagers, they saw it immediately and they answered it. I said, what's he going to choose? They said, desire for other men. What does this illustrate? The Anglo-Saxon warrior is picking that killing people is his identity because that's what his culture tells him is acceptable. The modern day New York man is picking homosexuality because his culture is telling him that's what's acceptable behavior. So who is dictating who he is in his identity? His culture. And that's the root of the problem. So, when we think about this and then how we're going to live out Paul's words, do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed. And my world is trying to push me into a mold that says truth is relative. It exists inside the individual. It does not exist outside of you. What so many people who are claiming Christianity are already doing is capitulating. The Methodist denomination has recently split over this very issue because most of the American churches have said we will cave to the culture instead of to Scripture. How am I going to listen, these are extraordinary times. But extraordinary times present extraordinary opportunity. People are confused and people are hurting, and it presents wonderful opportunity to show them why Christianity is the lifestyle that makes the most sense. That it's the one that actually leads to human flourishing. It's the one that leads to productive societies. Not any other religion, Christianity. And so, if you don't take anything else away, I hope that you will take this away. Because the Bible talks about this in places, it just doesn't use words like identity. When Paul in Ephesians and Colossians says, put off the old man and put on the new man, which is created in the image of God in his true likeness. What does he say? You have to trade your old identity for your new one. And that's what hopefully next Sunday night we're going to talk about. How does Christianity, because Christianity actually flows against not just modern identity, but also traditional identity in many ways. It flows against it. And Christianity allows us to take the good from multiple things and to unite them together. It's absolutely phenomenal. So, anyway, I guess you can tell me how bored you were later. But our kids and our grandkids are living this. And we've got to know what's going on so we can know when they're talking. That phrase, that's a red light. Something has been communicated to them that we need to work on. We need to work on this. But ultimately, as we said, we get the identity in Jesus. When we come to him with a penitent faith, confessing Christ to be immersed in water for the forgiveness of our sins, We enter into the relationship with him for which we were created. That's what our identity was always supposed to be. And we get to live that out, and it's an extraordinary existence. And tonight, the invitation is open to anyone who would desire to do that. And if we can help you, let us know as we stand and sing this song.